Chapter 17 of Aircraft and Submarines by Willis J. Abbot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. The Future of the Submarine, Part 2. So the days went by, and before long the merchant submarine had passed, without having been detected, beyond the territory in which British patrol boats were operating. Then came a succession of uneventful days and fine weather. Practically every day diving tests were made. One of these the captain describes as follows: "During these experimental diving tests we were treated to a spectacle of fairy-like loveliness. I had set the rudder in such a way that the turret was traveling about 3 yards under water. Overhead the sun shone brilliantly and filled the deeps with a clear radiance. The pure water was luminous with color. Close at hand it was of a light azure blue, of fabulous clearness and transparent as glass. I could see the entire boat from the turret windows. The shimmering pearls of the air bubbles which rise constantly from the body of the craft played about the entire length of the vessel from deck to bows, and every detail stood out in miraculous sharpness. Farther ahead there was a multi-colored twilight. It seemed as if the prow kept pushing itself noiselessly into a wall of opalescent green which parted, glistening, and grew to an ethereal, rainbow-like translucency close at hand. We were spellbound by this vision of beauty. The fairy-like effect was increased by medusæ which, poised in the transparent blue, frequently became entangled in the wires of the mine guards or the railings and glowed like trembling fires of rose, pale gold, and purple. But less pleasant things were in store for the Deutschland's crew. The nearer the boat came to the region of the Gulf Stream, the more violent the weather became. Though she still ran most of the time on the surface, it became necessary to keep all openings battened down. Even the manhole leading to the turret could be kept open only for short periods. Naturally the temperature was rising all the time. It was midsummer, and the Gulf Stream contributed its share of warmth. No wonder, therefore, that Captain Koenig compares conditions below decks to a veritable hell, and then continues: "While in the Gulf Stream we had an outer temperature of 28 degrees Celsius. This was about the warmth of the surrounding water. Fresh air no longer entered. In the engine room 2 6-cylinder combustion motors kept hammering away in a maddening 2/4 time. They hurled the power of their explosions into the whirling crankshafts. The red-hot breath of the consumed gases went crashing out through the exhausts, but the glow of these incessant firings remained in the cylinders and communicated itself to the entire oil-dripping environment of steel. A choking cloud of heat and oily vapor streamed from the engines and spread itself like a leaden pressure through the entire ship. During these days the temperature mounted to 53 degrees Celsius. And yet men lived and worked in a hell such as this. The watch off duty, naked to the skin, groaned and writhed in their bunks. It was no longer possible to think of sleep, and when one of the men fell into a dull stupor, then he would be aroused by the sweat which ran incessantly over his forehead and into his eyes, and would awake to new torment. It was almost like a blessed deliverance when the 8 hours of rest were over and a new watch was called to the central or the engine room. But there the real martyrdom began. Clad only in an undershirt and drawers, the men stood at their posts, a cloth wound about their foreheads to keep the running sweat from streaming into their eyes. Their blood hammered and raced in their temples. Every vein boiled as with fever. It was only by the exertion of the most tremendous will power that it was possible to force the dripping human body to perform its mechanical duty and to remain upright during the 4 hours of the watch. But how long would we be able to endure this? I no longer kept a log during these days, and I find merely this one note: temperature must not rise any higher if the men are to remain any longer in the engine room. But they did endure it. They remained erect like so many heroes. They did their duty, exhausted, glowing hot, and bathed in sweat, until the storm center lay behind us, until the weather cleared, until the sun broke through the clouds, and the diminishing seas permitted us once more to open the hatches. The Deutschland was now near her goal. Without any trouble she entered Hampton Roads and was docked at Baltimore. There her cargo was discharged and her return cargo loaded. This latter operation involved many difficulties. During her stay a United States government commission made a detailed inspection of the Deutschland to determine beyond all question her mercantile character. But at last the day of departure, August 1st, had arrived. Properly escorted, she made the trip down the Patapsco River and Chesapeake Bay. On her way down she made again diving trials, which Captain König describes as follows: "In order to see that everything else was tight and in good order, I gave the command to set the boat upon the sea bottom at a spot which, according to the reading upon the chart, had a depth of some 30 meters. Once again everything grew silent. The daylight vanished, the well known singing and boiling noise of the submerging vents vibrated about us. In my turret I fixed my eyes upon the manometer. 20 meters were recorded, then 25. The water ballast was diminished, 30 meters appeared, and I waited the slight bump which was to announce the arrival of the boat at the bottom. Nothing of the sort happened. Instead of this, the indicator upon the dial pointed to 32, to 33, to 35 meters. I knocked against the glass with my finger. Correct. The arrow was just pointing toward 36. "Great thunder! What's up?" I cried, and reached for the chart. Everything tallied. 30 meters were indicated at this spot, and our reckoning had been most exact. And we continued to sink deeper and deeper. The dial was now announcing 40 meters. This was a bit too much for me. I called down to the central and got back the comforting answer that the large manometer was also indicating a depth of over 40 meters. The two manometers agreed. This, however, did not prevent the boat from continuing to sink. The men in the central began to look at one another. Ugh! It gives one a creepy feeling to go slipping away into the unknown amidst this infernal singing silence and to see nothing but the climbing down of the confounded indicator upon the white-faced dial. There was nothing else to be seen in my turret. I glanced at the chart and then at the manometer in a pretty helpless fashion. In the meantime the boat sank deeper. 45 meters were passed. The pointer indicated 48 meters. I began to think the depth of the Chesapeake Bay must have some limit. We surely could not be heading for the bottomless pit. Then the boat halted at a depth of 50 meters without the slightest shock. I climbed down into the central and took counsel with Klees and the two officers of the watch. There could be only one explanation. We must have sunk into a hole which had not been marked upon the chart. When orders were now given to rise, it was found that the exhaust pumps refused to work. After a while, however, the chief engineer succeeded in getting them started. They reached the surface after about 2 hours of submergence. It was dark by the time the merchant submarine was approaching the 3-mile limit. Outside of it hostile warships were lying in wait. That the Deutschland escaped them well illustrates the fact that submarines may be kept by various means from entering a bay or a harbor, but that to blockade their exit is practically impossible. This is how Captain König speaks of his escape. "We knew that the most dangerous moment of our entire voyage was now approaching. We once more marked our exact position, and then proceeded to make all the preparations necessary for our breaking through. Then we dived and drove forward. All our senses were keyed to the utmost, our nerves taut to the breaking point with that cold excitement which sends quivers through one's soul, the while outwardly one remains quite serene, governed by that clear and icy deliberation which is apt to possess a man who is fully conscious of the unknown perils toward which he goes. We knew our path. We had already been informed that fishermen had been hired to spread their nets along certain stretches of the 3-mile limit, nets in which we were supposed to entangle ourselves, nets into which devilish minds had very likely been woven. Possibly these nets were merely attached to buoys which we were then supposed to drag along after us, thus betraying our position. We were prepared for all emergencies, so that in case of extreme necessity we should be able to free ourselves of the nets. But all went well. It was a dark night. Quietly and peacefully the lighthouses upon the two capes sent forth their light, the while a few miles further out death lay lowering for us in every imaginable form. But while the English ships were racing up and down, jerking their searchlights across the waters and searching again and again in every imaginable spot, they little surmised that at times within the radius of their own shadows a periscope pursued its silent way, and under this periscope the U Deutschland. That night, at 12 o'clock, after hours of indescribable tension, I gave the command to rise. We had broken through. Slowly the Deutschland rose to the surface. The tanks were blown out and the Diesel engines flung into the gearing. At our highest speed we now went rushing toward the free Atlantic. The homeward voyage was completed without untoward incident, and long before the month had ended the first, and probably last, merchant submarine was again safe and snug in her home port. The cargo carrying submarine, however, is by no means the only type of underwater vessel engaged in peaceful pursuits which has been suggested so far. Mr. Simon Lake, the American submarine engineer and inventor, has frequently pointed out the commercial possibilities of the submarine. In the early part of 1916 a series of articles from his pen appeared in International Marine Engineering. They contained a number of apparently feasible suggestions looking towards the commercial development of the submarine. First of all, he tells of experiments made with submarines for navigation under ice. The proper development of this idea, of course, would be of immense commercial value. Many harbors in various parts of the world are inaccessible during the winter months for vessels navigating on the surface. Navigation on many important inland lakes likewise has to be stopped during that period. Submarines, built so they can safely travel under the ice, would overcome these conditions and would make it possible to use most ice-bound ports throughout the entire year, at least in Mr. Lake's view. Ever since Mr. Lake began inventing and building submarines, he had been interested in the possibilities which submarines offer for the exploration of the sea bottom and for the discovery of wrecks and recovery of their valuable cargoes. His first boat, the Argonaut, as we have heard, possessed a diving chamber for just such purposes. He had continued his investigations and experiments along this line, and in these articles he shows illustrations of submarine boats and devices adapted for such work. Properly financed and directed, the recovery of cargoes from wrecks undoubtedly would not only bring large financial returns to the backers of such a venture, but also do away with the immense waste which the total loss of sunken vessels and cargoes inflicts now on the world. Submarines in peace may yet recover for the use of man much of the wealth which submarines in war have sent to the bottom of the sea. Marine insurance, too, would be favorably affected by such an undertaking. Still, one other commercial submarine boat is advocated by Mr. Lake. This is to be used for the location and collection of shellfish on a large scale. Of this vessel, its inventor says: "The design of this submarine oyster dredging vessel is such that the vessel goes down to the bottom direct, and the water is forced out of the center raking compartment so that the oysters may be seen by the operator in the control compartment. With only a few inches of water over them, headway is then given to the submarine and the oysters are automatically raked up, washed and delivered through pipes into the cargo carrying chambers. Centrifugal pumps are constantly delivering water from the cargo compartments, which induces a flow of water through the pipes leading from the rake pans with sufficient velocity to carry up the oysters and deposit them into the cargo holds. In this manner the bottom may be seen, and by tracking back and forth over the bottom the ground may be cleaned up at one operation. This boat has a capacity of gathering oysters from good ground at the rate of 5,000 bushels per hour. The use of the submarine will make the collection of oysters more nearly like the method of reaping a field of grain, where one swath systematically joins on to another and the whole field is cleaned up at one operation. Man's greediness for profit has already driven the salmon from the rivers of New England, where once they swarmed. Mechanical devices for taking them by the hundreds of thousands threaten a like result in the now teeming rivers of Washington and British Columbia. Mr. Lake's invention has the demerit of giving conscienceless profiteers the opportunity to obliterate the oyster from our national waters. It does not appear, however, that, except as an engine of war, the submarine offers much prospect of future development or future usefulness. And as we of the United States entered this war, which now engages our energies and our thoughts, for the purpose of making it the last war the world shall ever know, speculation on the future of the submarine seems rather barren. That does not mean, however, that there will be a complete stoppage of submarine construction or submarine development. War is not going to be ended by complete international disarmament, any more than complete unpreparedness kept the United States out of the struggle. A reasonable armament for every nation, and the union of all nations against any one or two that threaten wantonly to break the peace is the most promising plan intelligent pacifism has yet suggested. In such an international system there will be room, and plenty, for submarines. Indeed, it is into just such a plan that they intelligently fit. Though not wholly successful in their operations against capital ships, they have demonstrated enough power to make nations hesitate henceforth before putting a score of millions into ponderous dreadnoughts which have to retire from submarine-infested waters, as the British did in their very hour of triumph at Jutland. They have not nullified, but greatly reduced the value of overwhelming sea power such as the British have possessed. A navy greater than those of any two other nations has indeed kept the German ships, naval and commercial, locked in port, but less than 200 inexpensive submarines bid fair to sweep the seas of all merchant ships, neutral as well as British, unless by feverish building the nations can build ships faster than submarines can sink them. Huge navies may henceforth be unknown. The submarine has been the David of the war. It is a pity that its courage and efficiency have been exerted mainly in the wrong cause, and that the missiles from its sling have felled the wrong Goliath. Aircraft and submarine. It is still on the cards that when the definitive history of the war shall be written, its outcome may be ascribed to one or the other of these novel weapons. The creation of American inventive genius. End of the Future of the Submarine, Part 2. End of Aircraft and Submarines, by Willis J. Abbot. Recording by William Tomcho.